This edition of Mac Voices is supported by Macstock Conference and Expo and the Midwest Mac Barbecue, set for July 16 and 17 in Woodstock, Illinois. Join me, along with Melissa Davis, the Mac Mommy, Jody Spangler of Lakeshore Mac, technologist Kirsten Sia, and Wally Cherwinski of Magic 22. Find out more and register to attend at macstock2016.com. And by Take Control Books, the answers you need now from leading experts. Learn more and download yours at takecontrolbooks.com. Welcome to Mac Voices. This is the Talk of the Mac community. I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, I have no idea, absolutely no idea why I don't have Dave Hamilton on more, but I got him this time. Dave, it's great to see you.
It is great to be here, Chuck.
And I am thoroughly embarrassed. I think it's because I listen to you and John do your own podcast that I feel like we talk all the time when really I'm just listening.
We don't. No, it's funny. Yeah, because when we sync up at trade shows or whatever, that's really the only time that we talk other than like backbeat business stuff, which is like sort of separate from like just being friends and geeking out.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's funny because whenever we meet up, it's as though you've been there for the conversations I've had with John, because you'll say, oh, yeah, you know, that thing from 2 weeks ago. It's like, yeah, I know about this, you know, but you and I didn't do this.
Yeah, it is sort of strange that we all have these weird relationships, like we're part of each other's lives, but just not directly.
Asynchronously, Chuck.
Asynchronously. I like that.
Yeah.
And that, what an intro, Dave. What an intro.
That's what I do.
You and John on the Mac Geek Cab have been talking in bits and spurts and pieces about routers. You and I had a couple conversations at CES this year about routers. And you're a router geek and self-described router geek.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I always have been. And I think it started when I got an ISDN connection in Texas. And this was, 1998, right after we moved into our house. And I had to buy a router. It was a 3Com ISDN LAN modem. I still remember it because it was this piece of magic that did the thing that all of our routers do now. It takes this internet connection and just shares it amongst your house. Now, at the time, that was not an always-on connection. But that router made it seem like it was an always-on connection. If my computer went to check my email, it would, the router would see it and fire up the ISDN connection and off we'd go. And that today seems like, well, yeah, duh. But back then, coming from dial-up, it was magic. This was right before we all started getting cable modems. So, right. And then when I got a cable modem, of course, the money I spent on the ISDN LAN modem was, all for naught, or all for 2 months, because I got a cable modem about 2 months after that. And so I built a Linux box with 2 Ethernet cards that I used. Actually, I used that, but in the interim, I think there was an app that Peter Sichel wrote that allowed me to make my Mac a router for my cable modem initially. And then I built the Linux box to do it. Yeah, over one Ethernet port. Man, I haven't thought about this in a long time. Wow. That's not why you have me here, though.
No, but it just goes to show the level of depth that you have when it comes to this topic. I mean, yeah. I say the word router and you just take off for the moon.
I do. I know. Yeah. So I'll try and reel me in, but you need to, Frank, let's be frank. You have to be the one to reel.
Well, I thought it would be interesting to have a discussion, a sort of hopefully an organized discussion and focusing on sort of 3 levels. There's the level that I want a router, and I need a router, I think, and I want to plug it in and have it work and never touch it. Then there's a level that, okay, I need a router, and I don't mind doing some adjustments or tweaks every so often, if necessary, if it'll give me an honest-to-God benefit, not just to geek out on it. And then, of course, there's your level where you're building routers yourself and turning Macintoshes into routers. So
I don't do that anymore. But that's only because people build routers that give me enough that I'm not driven to that. It was all any of this. I mean, look, I'm a geek. I enjoy being a geek, and I enjoy the esoteric stuff that goes along with that. But everything in terms of routers, everything that I do is driven by the need to get it done. And again, I accept that my needs are a little geekier than maybe most people's, but We'll go into that.
Yeah. And my perception, Dave, is that recently, or maybe I just haven't been paying attention, but recently there have been some real changes to what is being built into routers, so that that level 1 and level 2 may actually see some improvements if they do some upgrades.
Big time. Yeah, we've called this the year of the router, and not because there's anything new that can be done with routers. It's just a lot of the stuff that it used to require a real geek to be able to do and manage, on a day-to-day basis, is now some of those smarts are being built into routers as core functionality, which is great. Because there's things we need to do, like getting wireless to the odd corners of our homes and making sure we have enough bandwidth. That's where all this comes from is, can the router just work? Can my network just work so that I can do everything I want to do no matter where I am in the house, and I don't have to stop and say, dang it, so-and-so's uploading pictures or so-and-so's watching Netflix. I got to, stop them so I can do what I need to do. The goal is for that never to happen.
And there's a little bit of a selfish motivation here, because I have guests on all the time. And if somebody in the house is using up some bandwidth, guess what? Our connection suffers.
That's right.
So, maybe I can gently suggest that they listen to this interview, and they'll get some tips on what to do.
Sure.
I'll confess, I'm one of those guys that I had some bad experiences years ago with routers. And then when Apple came out with the airports, in fact, there's one right
I was going to say, there's one right over your shoulder.
There's one right there. And it was just such a joy to be able to go in, use the setup assistant, walk through. It just works. I never have to touch it or anything. But judging by the conversations I've heard you and John have, that may not be the best thing for me at this point.
It's not. It used to be, frankly, and I don't fault Apple's path here. And Apple has always erred on the side of less configuration and more simplicity, because it allows people to have a consistent Apple experience. And I totally get that, right? I mean, we frankly all buy into some level of that.
Sure.
I don't buy into it with the router per se, but I buy into it with my Mac. There's a reason I have an iPhone and a Mac, and not an Android and a Windows machine, right? And that simplicity is it. When our internet connection speeds were much slower, to the point where really anything you wanted to do that was bandwidth heavy would totally take over your entire connection, you didn't need a smart router to do anything for you there, because it didn't matter how smart your router was. You were going to soak up your whole connection, either sending things out, pictures, uploading, whatever it was, or bringing things in, downloading movies, streaming movies, whatever it was. But now we have faster connections. And so a router with a little bit of smarts, because we have more headroom on that connection, and it's not going to, we don't need, when we download something, we don't need it to come in at the full speed of our router. When we upload something, we don't need it to go out at the full speed of our router. And yet, the way Apple's routers are built, that's exactly what happens. And that's fine and good if that's the only device acting on the network at that point in time. But now that we have so many things acting on the network all the time, you want to leave a little bit of headroom so that even when you're soaking up the connection, those things can still, do their little stuff. Your Nest thermostat can still, get a ping from the outside world. Your email can still check even when somebody in the house or three people in the house are downloading movies. So that's part of it. And then part of it's, your wireless, your ability to have wireless access everywhere, ubiquitous wireless access in your house.
And we also have this thing where we've gone from wireless to, 802.11, B, G, N, AC. The flavors have changed so much over a relatively short period of time, when I guess in the grand scheme of things. And so there's that thing of, and you can explain it better than I can, where if I put the wrong thing on my network, I slow my whole network down. And that gets frustrating, because sometimes I don't remember what this particular device is or that particular device is. And all I know is that I've got my home network here. And so what's your home network? Right there. Here's my password, and zing, it's on. And then my network speeds suffer.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a misconception. Putting a, say, 802.11g device on an 802.11n network won't immediately slow everything down to G speeds. G speeds being, we'll use the theoretical maximums just to go there. 54 megabits a second, which you'll never get, but that's okay. That's what it maxes out at. N, depending on how many streams you have, can be 450, but let's say it's just the one stream, so 150. Actually, N can go to 600. N can probably go above that if you had 5 streams. But with one stream, it's 150 megabits per second per stream. Putting a G device on that N network won't slow all of your N devices down to 54 immediately. But what will happen is the way Wi-Fi works, each radio, and this is without multi-user MIMO, which is a thing that only exists in some AC routers. So we're going to sort of defer that conversation. But the way routers traditionally work is they can talk to one wireless device at a time. And so when and they decide to move on after a fixed amount of packets, a fixed amount of data has been sent. Okay. So let's say it's 10 chunks of data. That it will accept from to or from one device before it says, all right, your turn's over. Now, next device, it's your turn. Send me or receive your 10 chunks, and then we'll move on. It just goes around and around. That's how it works. And then we're oversimplifying, but that's okay. When that happens and you have a slow device that's transmitting data, well, it takes that slow device longer to transmit its 10 chunks of data. And your fast device transmits those 10 chunks of data faster. But your fast device has to continually wait for the slow device to finish sending its 10 chunks. Okay. That's why it can slow down your network. Now, current, like 2016, maybe late 2015 routers have a feature, some of them have a feature called Airtime fairness. What this feature does is it changes the algorithm. And instead of saying, you get to send 10 chunks of data no matter how slow you are or how fast you are, you get a fixed amount of time in which to send as much data as you like. And then it's the next person's turn. And so this airtime fairness sort of mitigates that. Now, of course, Apple's routers don't have airtime fairness in them. But the newer ones from Netgear and Asus and I believe D-Link do. So that's where that comes from. And maybe I got geekier than you wanted, but this is an important thing because I think people misunderstand it.
Well, I think it's real easy to understand because when you hear your network slows down, your perception is I'm paying for all this money from Comcast or whoever, and because I'm sticking this older device or this Nest thermostat or whatever on, I'm basically killing what I'm paying for.
Yeah, so but you're not. Like a Nest is it transmits so little data that it's not, if you factor that into the previous equations, it doesn't matter. The Nest isn't going to slow you down. It's not like it's occasionally, like maybe once a year, it's going to download a firmware update. Okay, so yes, then it's going to slow you down for that brief period of time. But otherwise, in a general sense, it's like little bits of data back and forth, inconsequential.
Okay, and Nest may not have been the best example, but
but it's the one most people come to. So they're like, oh, I don't want to put my Nest on my same network as this because it's going to slow me down. Well, that good thinking, but the Nest is actually not going to hurt too much.
I hope this doesn't derail us from where I want to get to eventually. But how about security? There have been a couple things out there that now I'm not going to attribute this to anyone because I don't know who started it. But now the best thing you could do is have 3 different routers so that you have security. What?
Well, yeah, I mean, one to manage the other 2, right? And then one of the other 2, I think this is how people would propose this. One of the other 2 is your private secure network, and everything that goes out of it is like VPN to somewhere else. So it's, tunneled securely and all of that crazy stuff. And then a second router for your guest network. You could do that. Most of us, yeah. If you live in a home that, I think you could even get PCI compliance to store credit card data without doing that. So most routers that have guest networks we'll compartmentalize the data enough so that that's not a concern.
Okay, that's good. That's
Yeah.
good. Okay, so how about some of the things that are built in now or being built in that are accessible to mere mortals?
Yeah.
Is it worth buying? And I'm not going to. I'm going to let you call the names, but there's some out there that look like something out of Area 51. You know, with all the different angled wedges and the multiple antennas. And at some point you say, okay, how much performance do I need? How much can I get? And what is it going to cost me?
Right. So you're basically, for a consumer-focused router, you're going to start at $400 at the top end and go down. And you're going to go all the way down to like $80 for still a decent router. Most people are probably going to fall in the $100 to $150 range, to be quite honest. A couple of the features on the top-end routers are more radios, right? We started with single radio routers, 2.4 gigahertz. That's all we had. Then we added 5 gigahertz. And so now we have routers with 2 radios. And with 802.11ac, a lot of the kind of top-end routers are now shipping with 3 radios, 1 2.4 gigahertz and 2 5 gigahertz radios. And the idea is 5 gigahertz, when you're using 802.11ac, it's using up half the spectrum of the 5 gigahertz band. And so if you've got multiple devices that need to do this, you might be better off having some of them on one radio and some on another radio and still getting this massive amount of bandwidth. Because a lot of people now, instead of trying to run Ethernet cable or whatever, are just using their wireless to get their Netflix streaming to their TV. So you might want to segment your network that way and say, okay, this one radio, all I'm going to let it do is beam down to my Apple TV and my Roku and the things that are really important, and then I'll let the other 5 gigahertz radio just kind of be whatever happens to join it. And so that's what's happening in some of these top end routers, and you have choices in how you configure it. You can name them all something different and intentionally say I want this on this and that on that. Or the routers are actually getting smart enough to kind of look at what data each uses and sort of force these devices to the thing that is the right one for them. And and that's the sort of thing that gets me excited, because not that I like to control this stuff personally, but for most people, you don't want to have to think about it. You just want the router to do it. So that's one of the features. The other, and D-Link is doing this in a very cool way, and as is a company called Eero, that make routers that are built to use 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi as their backhaul between each other. So if you need to have 2 routers in your house to get full wireless coverage, you have your main router wherever that happens to be, and often it's not in a very good spot. It's just wherever your cable modem or your DSL modem comes in. And then you might want to put another router somewhere else in order, not a router per se, but an access point to share your Wi-Fi so that you get decent Wi-Fi signal. And in the past, that's just never worked well. Well, with 802.11ac, even a crummy connection can still transmit hundreds of megabits of data per second. I've got an 802.11ac router acting as an access point 2 stories below my main router in the house, and it's got a crummy connection. It's like 22% signal strength. I mean, it's just terrible, but it's still doing 300 to 500 megabits per second. Well, that's great. So I do that to get essentially the 2 routers connected, and then that router broadcasts a 2.4 gigahertz signal that's very clean and clear for that area of the house. You can do that manually, but you can also do it automatically with, like I said, some of the stuff from D-Link's one of them. Netgear has a bunch of extenders that do this for you. Eero, E-E-R-O, is a company. I haven't tested their stuff yet. It's actually, I should be testing it, I think, later this week. But they basically just build this. You put their stuff in your house and it automatically self-configures this mesh, and you don't have to think about it. You just have Wi-Fi everywhere. And that's the kind of thing that excites me and should excite, other people that need these things solved.
Well, yeah, that you don't have to be out there trying to figure out how to do all this and,
Exactly.
Taking your weekend just to get wireless. I mean, because I think that's what happens. I think people, they go down that road, they think, okay, I'll figure this out. By the end of the weekend, they take it back to wherever they bought it and they buy an airport. And there's nothing wrong with that except that you're not getting some of these new benefits at least. And who knows, next week, tomorrow, Apple could bring out a new version that would include some of this. But it doesn't seem likely because they don't seem to like to get what you get down in the weeds with routers and that kind of thing.
They don't. There's one feature in particular that's really missing from Apple routers, and that's called quality of service, or QoS. Most other manufacturers have it, and everybody sort of implements it in a different way. But really what it's about is, if we rewind to where we were talking about headroom, it's about managing your connection in a way that it's always leaving some of that headroom available and shaping your traffic so that if you're, downloading something that would normally be just a background thing and you don't really care, or you're uploading a ton of pictures, well, that's fine. But if you then fire up your Xbox and you say, I want to play a game where you need, really quick turnaround and a really tight connection with somebody else, it's going to prioritize that traffic. That's what quality of service, or QoS, does. Like I said before, because we have so much bandwidth available to us compared to what we used to have, we always want more, obviously. But QoS can really make a difference these days. And Apple's routers, we've been doing a lot of testing lately, they have zero in the way of QoS. If you've got something either downloading or uploading that's going to hit the maximum of your cable modem or your DSL modem, you're going to run into some problems. Now, you may not notice those problems if you're not also trying to do something else at the same time, but they're there. And, the problem is it's a tough thing, because as soon as you offer that in a router, it adds complexity to the configuration, and that's what Apple tries to avoid. But I can't think that they're going to avoid it for that much longer. I think they've got to buy into this. And it could just be a software update.
Yeah, and it's ironic. Wow, that's an interesting thought. It's ironic that we have all these not problems, but I'll call them issues, because we have all this bandwidth.
Yeah.
I mean, you would have thought, boy, if I could, a few years ago, if I could just get this much, all my problems would be solved. And I can't think of a good analogy, but I guess that if you get that much bandwidth, it's the management that you have to do that's critical.
Well, it's not that, we had this same problem with less bandwidth. It's just, we don't need to have this problem anymore because we can buy that headroom, right? For example, if your iPhone right now started uploading a slew of pictures that you took, right? It's going to do that at full speed. And we're on Skype right now. And so our Skype connection is going to degrade because of that. And you have no control over when that happens or how it works or any of that. It's just your iPhone says it's time to upload. And so it wants to upload as fast as it can. And we want that almost as fast as it can. We want your router to be smart enough to say there's a Skype connection happening. Let's make sure that stays pure, and then we'll let this other stuff happen.
Okay, so let's just pretend that happens for a second, and I want to go back to something there. But
Sure.
let's say my iPhone suddenly decides to do that. So what happens? Is it just a matter of the two devices competing, or does the bandwidth just get cut in half, and half goes to Skype, half goes to the iPhone?
No, it's not smart enough to just say half and half. What will happen is this. As soon as you hit the limit of your cable modem's provisioning, so your cable modem can probably do 10 times the speed that you actually get, but you only buy a certain amount of bandwidth from the cable company. And so they send a little profile down to your cable modem that says only allow, 100 megabits down and 10 megabits up. And that's it. And when the cable modem hits that limit, it is a brick wall. It says, that's it. I'm not letting anything else through. So if your router is just trying to shove all this data into this pipe, it will shove it all in. But when the cable modem says, no, you've sent enough for this particular period, well, that then has to go get in the back of the line. And so our Skype connection would get very laggy. Skype's smart enough to start lowering the bandwidth because it thinks that's the problem, which of course it is, but it's not Skype's fault. It's the problem. It's something else. But so it would get jaggedy and stuff in the video. But what would happen is we'd wind up talking over each other because we wouldn't be in sync anymore, because these packets would be taking so long to finally leave your network, or in the case of a download happening, finally get back in. But in your example, it's uploading. So it'd be, every time I send you video, your computer says, got it. And then I know to send you more. Well, if your computer's got it, takes too long to get back to me. If that acknowledgement takes too long, then things start getting weird. And that's what we want to avoid. And Apple's routers just don't avoid that. Again, you might not run into this problem all the time. We obsess over it because it's, we're geeks, but it may be the kind of thing that you don't ever notice, or it might be the kind of thing you notice all the time.
I think there's some real practical reasons, because this is one of the reasons that I don't turn on automatic anything. Automatic updates, automatic downloading. I need to be in complete control, because while we're doing this interview, I don't want suddenly anything to decide, hey, it's time to download this update or fix something. And so as a result, I confess, as a result, not everything probably gets updated quite as promptly as it could or should, which that introduces a whole nother set of reasons to go about figuring out how to manage this a little better.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas me, I leave all my updates on, and they've probably been happening while we've been doing this. And as long as everything's working right, which I guess it still is, we would never know.
Yeah, because at least so far, the video seems to be rock solid. So you must be doing something right.
Yeah. Well, my router is.
The router is. Okay, so one other thing, and then we'll get maybe to some specific recommendations. How the router is managing this traffic regardless of how it comes in. And what I mean by that is I've got a wireless connection for my iPad and my iPhone, but I've got a wired connection to this Mac and that Mac into the router. So is it analyzing the actual data throughput, or is there any decision making going on with how it's getting to the router?
Well, if you configure quality of service manually, you can say, I want that machine to have a higher priority than this one, or a lower priority. You can do all of that. But if you don't have any of that, it's your router. It's really important to understand that your router is actually doing the job of two different pieces of hardware that are baked into one. It's a router that's managing your network and the traffic in and out of your home. And then it's also a wireless access point that allows, wireless devices to connect. So once it gets to the point of routing, the traffic is all, unless you specify otherwise, the traffic is all treated equally. So the routing portion doesn't really know or care that this piece of data came from a wireless client, this piece of data came from a wired client. It doesn't. It's not important at that point. It's, and really, to be fair, the router is probably doing the job of three pieces of hardware, and we add a switch to that, an Ethernet switch, right? So there's the Ethernet switch, there's the wireless access point, and both of those then feed into this other device that's all in the same box called the router.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I wanted to make sure, because the other thing that you do when you go and start shopping for routers, some have 2 ports, some have 20 ports. Yeah. How many ports do I really need? And am I better off, at least for purposes of this discussion, am I better off getting something and just running Ethernet Ethernet everywhere to try to connect everything that way, as opposed to using some of the wireless functionality?
Well, it's always better to use Ethernet. There's no, I don't think we'd have too much argument on that, except if you don't have Ethernet run to where you need it run. And then we get a lot of argument because you have to start tearing open walls and do things like that. And that's typically not fun. I guess it's fun for some of us, but it's not typically not feasible, even if it is fun. So you wind up doing some things with Wi-Fi that, I mentioned in the house, I've got a wireless connection now heading down to 2 floors below where my router is. Well, if I had an Ethernet drop there, I'd just use that. It's not that I want to use Wi-Fi. Right. It's that it's the simplest way to do it.
Yeah. Okay, I lied. One more question before we get to recommendations. When you're talking about being able to prioritize devices, is it possible to prioritize applications? And in this case, Skype, or uploading or downloading to YouTube or whatever.
It totally is. You can, and this is where it totally depends on the router. Most routers are Unix devices at their core. Okay, they're all running some flavor of Linux. It wouldn't surprise me if Apple's routers are running Linux too. There's just so much already available that I can't imagine they would have reinvented that wheel, but they're Apple, so they might have. But everybody else on the planet is running Linux on their router. It's an embedded version of Linux that they build and put on the router. And so every version of Linux basically has the same routing tools, but it depends on what graphical interface any given router manufacturer has decided to put on top of that. So some routers, yes, you can absolutely say, I want Skype and YouTube to have a higher priority than FTP or BitTorrent or something like that, right? And I want my Xbox to have an even higher priority than that. Absolutely. And again, you can mix and match. You can say, well, I want that computer and then Skype traffic from any device to be prioritized. And some of them are smart enough to know that. They can look at the packets. Packets are, for a lot of things, very telling of what their purpose is in life in many different ways. And so, yes, but it requires a router that's fast enough to do all this on the fly and still get you the speed that you want. So that's where a lot of these, you'll see on the shelf, people say, oh yeah, it's got a dual core, 1.2 gigahertz processor. Why? Why does my router need a dual core? That's why. It's doing all this stuff in real time, as quickly as it possibly can. And that's what you need.
Okay. So we started out the conversation trying to break the audience into 3 levels. And so if you can, give us some recommendations for all 3. First, obviously, for the guy who just wants to plug the router in, have everything work as best it can and doesn't want to mess with it and isn't terribly picky.
Yeah. TP-Link has some decent routers in the $100 range. I wouldn't recommend anything that's not an AC 1900 router these days. And by AC 1900, and you'll see this used by all manufacturers, it's sort of a universal term. It's referring to the wireless capabilities, AC, and 1900 to the speeds. So a 1900 router means you've got 600 megabits per second of 2.4 and 1300 megabits per second of 802.11ac. So you're never going to actually get that speed, but that's looking for an AC 1900 router. I like some of the stuff that TP-Link has out, and you can often find them in that kind of 79 to 99 range. The Archers, they've got the C7, the C8, and the C9. And, they're like the Performa days, Chuck. I don't always know which is which, but buy an AC 1900. I think the C9 these days is about 149, but occasionally you can find it a little cheaper than that. But they've got they know what they're making there. So
okay, all right, that's good. So now we move to the middle ground where I don't mind doing some work and I want better performance. I want some of the controls we're talking about if I can have them at this level without having to go in and tweak it every week.
Yeah, at that point it starts getting the lines start to blur, if you will, because you can spend really you got to make 2 decisions. Do you want the capabilities and do you want 3 radios, right? Because that's where this is going to come from. You can get a lot of these capabilities kind of as you get closer to the $200, maybe $250 range. The R7000 from Netgear, the R7500 from Netgear, those are dual core. Sorry, they are dual core, but they're all dual radio routers. And then you can get to the R8000 and the R8500 from Netgear, which are tri-band routers. And the R8500 is just even faster than the R8000. D-Link has some of this stuff too. Linksys's 7500 is a great router. And I think that's in the 179 range. I'm going to look it up here and be rude while we're talking.
No, that's okay.
Yeah. It's the I said R7500. It's the EA 7500.
Okay.
And I think that's it's 179 on Linksys's website. So you're probably going to get that for 150 or something. But that's a great AC 1900. It supports multi-user MIMO, which I sort of mentioned before and skipped over. But what that does is it allows the router to talk to more than one client simultaneously. So that whole airtime fairness discussion that we had sort of goes out the window when you can run a multi-user MU-MIMO. So they call it MU-MIMO. When you can run that, but clients have to support it too. So until you have clients that support MU-MIMO, and most of us don't even have a single one yet, let alone all of them. But that's where we'll go. And then if you've got a router that can do, 4 streams at once, giddy up, 4 devices truly simultaneously communicating. And buying a router now, especially if you can do it in that 179 range, that can do that down the road, well, that's good money. That's money well spent.
When you say clients, are you talking about browsers or mail programs, or is that what you're referring to?
No, I mean devices. So your
devices.
iPhone, your Mac, none of those things. There are some Windows machines that support MU-MIMO right now, but they're few and far between at the moment. But that'll change within the next year. I think Apple will be supporting it, I hope, because it makes a lot of sense. Your iPhone's not going to do tons and tons of bandwidth, so you don't need your iPhone chewing up multiple streams. In fact, it only chews up a couple right now. It'd be better to leave those other 2 streams for somebody else.
Right. And at this level, we can expect to be able to configure applications or devices to give those priority if we want to, or the device can handle it itself.
Well, you would enable quality of service or QoS on the router. And then a lot of these routers kind of auto-configure. They sense the speeds of your network and sort of put in their own profiles of what most people want. And for, I would say, 99% of the people, myself included, their profiles are perfectly adequate. It's what you want.
Okay, that's an interesting comment, because some of the, again, I'm drawing off of some of the conversations you and John have had, and again, by the very nature of your show, you're solving people's problems. You're kind of doing a hit here and hit there, and not really a tutorial. So if I plug one of these modems in, one of these routers in, it self-configures. In other words, I don't have to go in and tell it this is my speed. It figures it out.
Yeah, so Netgear is one of them, but they're not the only vendor. You would go in and it's off by default, but you go in and you say, I want to turn on quality of service. And then it says, if you want, you can enter your speeds here, or hit the speed test button. The router will do its own speed test and populate itself. And then the second question is, do you want to configure all your own parameters? Or do you want us to download the latest version of our sort of Netgear home user profile and keep that up to date for you? And the answer should be yes to both of those questions. Really, I meant that 99% number, and I mean that I'm included in it. If I were running that router, and when I have, I just turn it on and let it go, and it's awesome. Works great.
All right. Again, I keep getting to things I want to get to the end, but I want to make sure we stay here.
Sure.
As far as the interfaces go and the software that's coming with these, has it improved? Because it used to be bad. The routers we're talking about, I mean, is it approachable by a human?
Yes and no. Yeah, I mean, it's way better than it used to be. Way better, Chuck. But there's parts of it where you're going to get into a realm and say, oh, why am I? What does this mean? Yeah, and that's sort of, I understand why Apple limits the number of features they put in the airport routers. Again, I mentioned it before in passing, but a software update, if it were possible to an Apple router, could enable all sorts of features. It has, plenty of RAM and plenty of CPU, and obviously the radios are very, very good. So it could do all of these things. It just currently does not. In fact, it's probably running some version of Unix, be it, OpenBSD or Linux, that already has the capability of doing it. You just have no way of touching it. But it's because of that, right? Because it starts getting really esoteric and geeky really fast. So, for example, Netgear and other Linksys does this too, has they have a basic mode and an advanced mode. And in basic mode, you see less options than you see in advanced mode. And it's a little frustrating because when you turn on advanced mode, there's some things in basic mode you don't get to see anymore. So you sometimes are bouncing back and forth. So these interfaces are not perfect, but they're pretty approachable, I'll say. My favorite router interface by far right now is on the Synology, their RT1900 AC, which is their only router. And again, as you might have guessed, it's a 1900 AC router. So that's a good thing. It's got plenty of wireless speed. And Synology has been building network attached storage for decades. And because of that, they've learned a lot about creating a great browser-based user interface for their disk station NAS devices, and their router software has that same UI, and it's killer. It's really, really good. There's a couple of quirky things with it. It's their first time out. There's like the quality of service is really weird to enable and turn on, but it's all right there, and it's a very nice kind of touchy-feely browser interface. So,
okay, good to know. And I think I talked to them. In fact, I know I did. I talked to them at CES this year. Yeah. So if you go back and look, folks, there's something there from one of their representatives to chat about. Okay, so let's move to level 3, where the Dave Hamilton router. Yeah. That they didn't even bother to put the screws in because they know you're going to take them out.
I have only taken the screws out of 2 routers in my life, and the only reason I did that was because I had to connect a serial cable to the inside of it because I put some firmware on the router. I updated some software on it that totally bricked the thing, and I needed to resurrect it from the dead. So that's yes, it happens. It hasn't happened in a long time for me, but there is years ago. Again, when I moved from running my own Linux box as a router, I had gotten very used to being able to pick and choose all of my options. I mean, everything. I could just, if I needed something, I just downloaded whatever open source software it was and I compiled it. And then it was running on the box. Well, I wasn't the only one. And a lot of open source firmware for routers sort of cropped up out of this sort of community. And so I've been running open source firmware on my routers for over 10 years. I've really never, other than brief stints, and most recently it was with the Synology, the RT1900 AC. There's just one thing it won't do. But otherwise, I was almost ready to give up my open source firmware. The open source firmware I run is called dd-wrt. And it runs on all kinds of different routers. Not every router, but it runs on many of them. And it's just very configurable. The interface actually is better than most of the interfaces you get from off-the-shelf routers. And most manufacturers, Asus and Netgear especially, really sort of support the open source firmware with open arms. Buffalo kind of started us down that path, but and they're doing quite a bit of that now too as well. So that's and it there's really no one router that I would choose because I get the same interface and the same features, software features anyway, from every router with this one firmware, and it's handy. So these days I'm using, this call is going over a Netgear R8500, which is a AC 5300 router with 3 radios and all of that, but it's running third-party firmware that's not even really released by the open source community yet. It's out because the router's so new. They're still testing it. So I'm, I think I was one of the first that installed it that wasn't a developer, but it's fine. Works out mostly.
And the picture goes dark right about
that.
Yeah.
No, it's been good for about the last week and a half. Well, okay. I'll say that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So it sounds like if you're into that, you're going to want to be running this open source firmware and software, and figuring out which routers it runs on, which is kind of strange. It almost feels to a lot of us like putting the cart before the horse, but probably not for you.
No, it's just give me the raw hardware and the fastest processor that I can get and the best radios I can get, and then I'll put my software on it. Thanks. I don't I still test all of this stuff because we talk about it on Mac Geek Eps, and for this too, I need to have experience. So the R8500, I ran it for I think about a month with its stock firmware and really just got to experience that. And there's always one thing, and it's not always the same thing, but I've gotten so spoiled having all of these little features. I feel like Synology is the company to really take us to where geeks might want to go in a very user-friendly way, because with their disk stations, they have this concept of packages. So you install, you set up the disk station and you get a web interface to it, and it'll share files and all that sort of stuff out of the box. And then you say, okay, well, now I want to set up a media server for my video. And you can install third-party ones like Plex, Or you can install their own video station, but you download it from them and install it on the router as a package. And it's very, very simple and very easy, and it's all graphical, and you don't have to be a Unix guru or even know that it's running Unix underneath. And then you've got an extra feature. And there's hundreds of packages available for the Synology disk stations. The router, not quite as many. I think it's, there might be dozen, not dozens, but dozen packages available. Maybe it might be 8 to 12 at the moment. But that's where these extra features start to come from. And you can really get to tweak things or not, depending on your needs. And that's why I'm really excited about this Synology stuff.
Yeah, I definitely got the right guy for this show. No question about it. No question about it. You live and breathe this stuff.
So the one person who's still listening, give me a call. We can talk about this.
No, actually, I'd like to think that we've helped people understand a little bit more. I mean, I know there's a lot more depth we can go into, and so folks, I would encourage you go back and check out like the last month and a half, 2 months of Mac Geek Gab, not just for the great content, but also for some of these discussions, because John and Dave get in, they dive deeper into individual pieces that we've just touched on.
Yeah, and thank you for letting me have this, because I've really been limiting the amount of Mac Geek Gab that turns into Router Geek Gab, because it would be very easy. Well, there's just so much cool stuff going on that it would be so easy to do this for an hour on Mac Geek Gab every week, and that's not necessarily the right thing for us. So, we've got to sort of serve a wider audience.
Oh yeah, but I have to tell you, those dips into this is what caused me to contact you and say let's do a little deeper dive, and hopefully this has been it. Yep. We got to do this again, and well, no, not again, more often. That's all there is to it. Promote everything that you're involved with, and that should take about 25-30 minutes. So.
I'll do it quickly. So Mac Geek Gab, we've mentioned, macgeekgab.com is where you can find out all about that. It's a podcast we do every week, answering people's questions, solving their problems, and having some fun. Then you can find me on Twitter at Dave Hamilton. You can find me, I write occasionally, and actually more recently, even more than occasionally, over at our site, macobserver.com. So that's where you can find me.
No, I'm not going to let you get away with it.
Okay.
I can think of at least one or two other podcasts I know you're involved in.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is great. So I do the Small Business Show with Shannon Jean, who is the founder of Mac Rescue and then Tech Restore, and he and I did deals on the web for a long time together. So we do the Small Business Show at businessshow.co, talking about all kinds of things of interest to small business owners. And then with Paul Kent, my dear friend out in California, he and I do Gig Gab every week, a podcast for working musicians. And actually, I'll tell you, the audience to that is not just musicians. We've found that people that like to go see music or whatever get as much out of it as people who are musicians. So it's a lot of fun. So, and then there's Backbeat Media, which is the thing that I alluded to earlier when Chuck and I talk about podcast advertising. That's our company that we do that with too.
Yep. And of course, I'm going to fill in for you because you're not getting them all. The daily observations thing that you're a regular on.
I am. That's true. Yep. Yeah, Mac Observer's Daily Observations at TMO Daily on Twitter.
Now, are you hiding anything else from me, Dave? Because those
probably.
Probably? Okay. All right.
It's not intentional, except for that one thing. But
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll work on that one thing when you come back.
That's right.
Hey, it's great to see you, my friend. Thanks so much.
Thanks for doing this. This was fun. It was a nice way to wrap up the day here.
Hey, we'll do it again.
Awesome.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is Mac Voices. I hope you got a lot out of this. If you have questions, contact Dave, contact me. I'll send them on to Dave because I don't have a prayer of answering them. Until the next time, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, Google+, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the Mac Voices blog. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the MacVoices Dispatch, to stay up to date on all the latest Mac Voices news from our front page or at macvoices.com/newsletter. Do more with your Apple tech by subscribing to the free Mac Voices magazine on Flipboard by visiting macvoices.com/magazine. Advertising and sponsorships handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CashFly at cashfly.com.